Hello everyone, and welcome to this lecture on using PostgreSQL with Python and using the library Psycopg2. So I'm right now using the Jupyter Notebook system in order to show you how all this syntax works. You can feel free to use any editor or IDE that you prefer for Python. If you've already experienced one of my other Python courses, you're probably already really familiar with the Jupyter or IPython notebook system. If you're not and want to find out more, you can go to www.jupyter.org and explore that website, and I'll also give you a link on how to install it. And you can explore it more. I really like it as far as for teaching and quick scripts, but you can also explore everything we're about to do in your preferred IDE or development environment for Python. So let's go ahead and start by just importing the library that we downloaded from the previous lecture. So again, go to the previous lecture for more notes on how to actually download everything, and for the .py file that has all the code that I'm going to execute here, or the notebook file that has, again, all the code and some notes of what I'm going to execute here during the lecture. So to get started, like I was saying, we need to import Psycopg2. So Psycho, let me make sure I spell that right, Psycopg2. So by convention, we just import it as pg2. And then the next thing you're going to do is connect to your database. And by convention, that's CONN. And you're just going to say pg2 and then call the connect method. And you're going to pass in a couple of arguments here. The first one is what database you're going to connect to. I'm going to go ahead and connect to the DVD rental database that we've been working with a lot. And then you have to define the user. So depending on how you actually set up your PgAdmin account, you may have set up your own particular username. If you don't specify the username in this argument of the connect method, it'll automatically, by default on a Windows computer, and I believe on a Mac as well, default to the user profile name. But if you've just been following along with all the lectures, the default for PgAdmin as far as the username is just Postgres. So if you're having any trouble with your own username, try just saying Postgres, and if you set everything to default, it should be Postgres. And then the last thing you have to input is your password. Now, I've already set up my password as the variable called secret up here. So if you want, you can just set up a variable called secret and put in your password. Obviously, my password is not the string. Your password goes here. So if you've done all this correctly, you should be able to run this line of code or put this line of code inside your .ipy file, and then you should have a connection there. So in this Jupyter Notebook system, I'm basically just running each of these cells as a separate block of code, and that way I can run the cells and show you the output at the same time. So now that we've established the connection to PostgreSQL, the next step is to retrieve the cursor. And the cursor is just a control structure that enables traversal over the records in a database. So you can basically think of it as some sort of iterator or pointer for SQL data retrieval. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go ahead and create a variable called CUR. And then we're going to have a connection object. So that was this CONN. And then we call the cursor method off of it. And so now we have our cursor. And that was essentially the last thing we needed to do in order to execute SQL queries from Python. So using that cursor object, I can say execute off of it. And then you basically, inside the execute method, you pass in a string of whatever you want to actually ask the database or query the database of. So we can say something like this: select asterisk from, let's go ahead and say from payments. So now this cursor has that execute statement. And this cursor then has a couple of methods available. It has fetch all, fetch many, and fetch one. So what these do is they basically return rows of data. So if I just say fetch one, it will return the first row of that data. So these are the numbers that correspond with that row of data from select everything from payment. I can also say fetch many, and then actually pass in how many rows I want to fetch. So I can fetch 10 rows. And you'll notice that it returns it as a list of tuple items, which is nice because then you can use tuple unpacking later on. And also note that depending on the data type, it'll also specify like a date time data type if you had a timestamp information on it for that particular column in your database table. So those are really the main features you're going to be using with Psycopg2. And as far as using this all in Python, it's going to be kind of up to you how you use these main 3 or 4 commands in order to use the power of Python and use the automation capabilities of Python to query your database or put things into your database. So again, let's just go over what we've done so far. You had to import Psycopg2 as pg2. Then you had to establish a connection. I set it as the variable CONN. And you said pg2.connect. You had to pass in the database name you were connecting to, pass in the user you were connecting as. The default user for any Postgres application is Postgres. And then you had to pass in the password that you set up when you were first installing PgAdmin and PostgreSQL. Then you had to get a cursor off of that connection. And with that cursor, you could then execute SQL queries off of it. And then once you have that cursor execute that query, you can actually fetch the rows that are returned. You can fetch many rows, you can fetch just one row, or the final option is actually to fetch all of them. And notice here, since there's quite a few rows, you may want to use this carefully. Otherwise, you'll just end up with a ton of rows returned. So let's go ahead and change that back to fetch 1. So again, this is really nice because you can use tuple unpacking along with it. So you can say something like, if we just say fetch many such as 10, let me actually execute that query again. Notice I had to execute the query in order to fetch them off. So let's go ahead and execute that query one more time. And we'll say this is equal to data. And now if I take a look at data, I have this list, and I can index off of it as you would expect, tuple unpack it, keep indexing off of it just to get particular data points. It's really up to you as far as what you're going to use this type of data for in this sort of Python with Psycopg format with. But hopefully, basically, these lines are the most important ones, and they can really be your building blocks as far as how you're going to use PostgreSQL with Python. That sort of application is really up to you, and more likely than not, it's just going to be a smaller part or back end of your application in Python when you're communicating with your database. Once you're done communicating and executing off your database, you're going to want to close your connection. So you're going to want to say your connection and go ahead and close it. And that's really all there is to it. You can check out the .ipy or Python file from the previous lecture or the IPython notebook file from the previous lecture to get a couple more useful hints and tips for how to use Psycopg2 with PostgreSQL and Python. Other than that, that's really just the basics of it, and that's kind of all you need to know to start exploring how you can use PostgreSQL with your own Python applications. Again, the most important parts are just the import, establishing that connection, creating the cursor, and then executing the SQL queries. One thing I wanted to note is to make sure that you kind of avoid using Python print formatting or string formatting when you're executing these SQL queries. And what I mean by that is, imagine you have this situation where you want to say execute and you input some commands. And let's say earlier in your code, your command line was something like maybe it was select all from, and then you were going to add another string to it later on. So maybe that string was another object. And what I'm trying to say is you may want to be careful when you're doing this sort of thing with Psycopg and PostgreSQL with Python, because it's kind of dangerous if you accidentally call add something like drop table later on. This could kind of like potentially screw up your database. So just keep that in mind. It's always best practice to put in the entire SQL query as just one single string and to verify that it's a single string that you want. There's a couple more notes on that in the notebook, but it's just something to be aware of. Okay, with that being said, That's really it as far as just a quick overview of how you can use Psycopg and PostgreSQL with Python. Feel free to ask any questions in the discussion section of the course, and you can also feel free to refer to the resources from the previous lecture for more hints and more tutorials on how to use this really useful library. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.